back to Leaders Recon. Today we're going to be talking about becoming an FA-50 and what the process for that looks like. And we have Lt Col Hoffman with us. Sir, welcome to the program.
Glad to be here, Josh.
So, I guess we have a little bit of history since you used to be part of the leader development team up here, working in combat field studies.
Yeah, it was a great assignment. Always good to work with the training division and of course with the leader development branch. So yeah, great to see you.
So, also a force manager though, and an avid hunter. You were just telling us a little bit about that.
Yes, I'm not as cool as my partner in crime in FA-50, Lt Col Croft. I don't have my name, on a Super Bowl trophy. But when I'm not in uniform, I'm still wearing camo, sitting in a tree stand, or spotting and stalking animals throughout the lower 48. So I can at least say that I fill the freezer as opposed to getting my name put on things.
Hey, well, that's what matters, right? We all got to eat. So.
That's right. That's right.
So talking about force management, though, you went from leader development, you're back in force management now.
Correct.
As an FA-50, can you tell me, what is it that force managers actually do?
Right. So force managers are really professional staff officers where we are working to inform leaders by Army senior leaders and leaders here within, senior leaders within the Army National Guard to manage efficiently and effectively change over time. So we really provide subject matter expertise into forums that are ran by the Army, things like Total Army Analysis, where we represent Army National Guard equities in those processes so that, again, over time, change can occur in an efficient and effective manner.
So a lot of advising decision makers at different echelons, what I'm getting, like, can you kind of, for those that are just really unfamiliar, can you give us, like, what is the impact that force managers have on the Army, on unit moves, on force structure changes, modernization, etc.?
Sure. Yeah. So right now, the Army is actually in one of its largest transformation, I guess you could say, periods in the last 30 to 40 years. So you're likely, and a lot of the listeners and viewers are probably very familiar with the Army of the past, 10 to 20 years being BCT-centric.
Roger, sir.
Built and organized to fight the global war on terror, rotational units through supporting CENTCOM, with the missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. So as the Army is shifting away from being COIN or global war on terror focused more towards a division-centric Army that's focused on being prepared for a near-peer fight in a large-scale combat. So force managers are really that provide that professional staff officer analysis and advice to senior leaders to manage that change, both from a organizational design and resourcing perspective of how we accomplish that transformation in an efficient and effective manner.
So, a lot of complex stuff there. Yeah. But from what I'm understanding, like basically, like force managers are like huge people on advising these command teams, is what you're saying,
right,
for like how this force structure changes happen and like if they should,
right,
or not.
How we determine what the requirements are, how we design organization to meet those requirements, and it's all really nested between having implementing national defense and service level strategy into organizational design, and then subsequently into a resourced force to accomplish those objectives. And
what are some of the factors that you consider then as a force manager when you're looking at like unit changes?
Right. So if there's a new capability, coming to the Army National Guard, based on that, transformation objectives for the Army, we really look at a number of areas and solicit inputs from the states. So what the manning requirements are for the new organization, what the training and facilities requirements would be, and what currently exists within our footprint, within the 54 states and territories, and what stationing location would be optimal for that new capability.
So, what's something, I guess let's go back to your story, sir. So like, as FA-50, can you kind of give us an example of like a rundown of, maybe a memorable change or something where you feel like you had a big impact on a unit's transformation or a new capability that came to the military?
Sure.
As a FA-50.
So I started in force management about a little over 10 years ago, actually at the state level. So I was a state force integration readiness officer. So the role of the FIRO is to really provide that synchronizing function for executing force management transformation.
Okay.
So kind of on the ground, rubber meets the road kind of force management work. And back in that time frame, in the 2011, 2012 time frame, as the Army, again, was optimizing BCTs for the global war on terror and rotational requirements for Iraq and Afghanistan, all of our special troops battalions that were part of the BCTs converted to being brigade engineer battalions. So what that entailed was some redesigns to the battalion staff, the leaders involved across and authorized within that staff, then also the composition of the downtrace companies. So went from having an engineer company, Signal and MI, to having 2 composite engineer companies. So in addition to the Signal and the MICO. So those transformations occurred in Pennsylvania based on the 3 BCTs that were assigned there at the time.
Okay, wow.
So so being part of that process, synchronizing and integrating, the recruiters across the state to make sure that we were going to be prepared to fill the new personnel requirements. Our construction facilities and maintenance office, so making sure that our facilities were adequate to house those organizations. And then, training facilities, that anything that we were going to need to make sure that that unit was man-equipped and trained on its E-date when it converted from being a special troops battalion to a brigade engineer battalion. That was a very meaningful and I would say important project that I worked on early in my force management career.
What was the biggest challenge you faced with that change?
So I think one of the challenges with that is I think from a National Guard perspective is always to me one of the most important and the biggest challenges manning.
Okay.
So to make sure that that both leaders are being developed, for that new change, because if you're going from a particular organizational design to having a new kind of staff function at the headquarters level, to make sure you're developing the leaders along the way so that when that unit stands up, its leadership is in place. And then also from a recruiting perspective, making sure that we had the proper soldiers in the training pipeline, and that we were able to man the unit at its highest level of personnel readiness.
Wow. So, I mean, there's a lot of complex things in here, right? It's almost too much to wrap your head around in like this short amount of time. But I mean, we're here really to talk about like becoming an FA-50, which I mean, you mentioned you served a role as a FIRO at the state level. Now you're at the Guard Bureau level, working on a little bit of a higher echelon. Can you tell us like, who can become an FA-50 and like how does that process work?
Right. So at the state level, the force managers are typically within a G3 at the state headquarters or a J3, depending how the state headquarters is organized. And oftentimes the primary FIRO is either an officer or a warrant officer at the state level.
Okay.
Now the functional area itself is generally only awarded to commissioned officers, but force management work at the state level can be done by commissioned officers, warrant officers, and enlisted. Here at the national level, we have commissioned officers and civilians that work within the Force Management Division. So my particular story is, as a Title 32 AGR officer, I was assigned as the FIRO, the Force Integration Readiness Officer. So I completed some of the basic force management coursework at the Army Force Management School at Fort Belvoir.
And before you get into that, when about in your career did this happen?
So I was a senior captain, and that's generally for commissioned officers, senior captains, so post company command or post captain KD assignments, or junior majors is kind of the desirable entry point into the Force Area 50 or Functional Area 50 force management functional area.
So you're a senior captain. You got assigned as a FIRO. Is that something that you were trying to do, or what was the motivation?
It was really I was almost from an assignments perspective. I didn't even know what a FIRO was when I got the call saying, "Hey, you're going to be the next FIRO." So I was certainly on a steep part of the learning curve. But yeah, so that was my first assignment in force management. I did that for about 3 years. And part of the FA-50 or force management qualification at the state level, that process is really governed by 3 different things. So you complete a 2-week force integration readiness officer course. So it's a force management course that's really specifically targeting FIROs, state level
Okay.
force managers here within the Army National Guard. And then you complete a 4-week course called How the Army Runs. And really what that course teaches is some really general framework for strategy. So how strategy is developed at the national, defense, and service level. The force development process, so how organizations are designed and built to meet those objectives. And then resourcing framework, how the Army does programming, planning, budget, and execution for actually basically paying for those organizations.
And so as a force manager, then do you dive into acquisitions much at all, or not really?
So acquisitions is a separate functional area.
Okay.
So there are folks who specifically work in the acquisition world who do that work. From a force development and equipment modernization, we are informed about those acquisition timelines and the Army's acquisition model, but we don't necessarily work in that day to day.
Okay. So you did the 4-week course, How the Army Runs.
Right.
And then did you get your functional area awarded right after you did those 2 courses, or how did?
So at the state level, you do those 2 courses,
Okay.
and then you're required to have, I believe it's 2 years of essentially on-the-job training. So you fill that role as a state-level force manager for 2 years, and at that point, as a commissioned officer, you're eligible for constructive credit for the FA-50 functional area. When I came up to the national level, here I did then go to the 10-week FA-50 qualification course when I re-entered into force management.
So there is like a qual course then
There is.
specifically for
There is.
FA-50s.
And the 10-week course and the 4-week course are quite similar, I would say. That the 4-week course, How the Army Runs, kind of gives you the overview of kind of those 3 areas I talked about: strategy development, force development, and then resourcing. And then the FA-50 qualification course, the 10-week course, kind of takes it down several layers into more detail. So you really do more examination of strategy development. You do some case studies and some actual practical exercises with force management and force development work.
And how challenging was that course?
So the course is, I would say, it's primarily academic. So there is some challenges there, just as far as wrapping your mind around strategy development and the force development process. And did bring a prop with me today. So the How the Army Runs manual, so the Senior Leader Reference Guide and Handbook of really what kind of governs those processes is really the driver there. So there's a lot of content and a lot of things to kind of absorb. And you sort of learn a new language when you go through the force management course, just learning all the different processes and sub-processes of total Army analysis, like I said, of planning, programming, budget, and execution, and all the different forms at the HQDA level, at the OSD level, and here even within processes within the Army National Guard.
Well, and can you tell us a little bit about that? So, like, what are the opportunities, because we're talking about FA-50s more so than force managers, or force management in general, right? So, what are the opportunities for FA-50s? We already know about the FIROs,
Right.
but what are the opportunities for them at each echelon past that?
Right. So primarily, we mentioned there at the state level, you're going to have your FIROs, and you might have some folks who are managing like new equipment training, new equipment fielding, kind of more on the equipment modernization side of the house. And then here at the more national level, here within Guard Bureau, we have 2 primary divisions that work within the G5 that work as FA-50. So the Force Management Division, where we really focused on organizational modernization. So read that like force design updates. So what the personnel and equipment authorizations, how the unit is designed to execute its core mission. And then our Force Development Division, also the FA-50 functional area, they work more along the lines of equipment modernization. So what type of things the unit is going to need now and in the future to best execute its core mission.
So then, did you feel like, having been in the FA-50 functional area now, or I guess that's a little bit of a restatement, but having been in the functional area for a while now, like, do you feel like there's caps for things that you're able to do? Like, how does it work with broadening assignments, or is it considered a broadening assignment? Do you kind of lose touch of your like traditional career within your branch, or can you explain that?
Sure, that's a great question. So here at the national level, when you do enter into the FA50 functional area, you kind of have really two options. You can stay in the FA50 career track where your key developmental assignments are as branch chief for one of the programming branches. So read that like being responsible for the programming of combat structure, support structure, or logistics. Also within my current assignment as the force integration branch chief. So you can stay kind of committed, solely to the FA50 work, but you also still have the opportunity to do broadening assignments if you want to go back, let's say to a state for battalion command or to a KD assignment outside of the OPR. So there are cases and examples where officers do both, where they enter into the functional area and then stay there for the remainder of their career, and those that also become FA50s and then kind of switch back and forth between being an FA50 here in the building or back into kind of their basic branch in perhaps MTO command somewhere.
So focusing on the state officers then, that are the FIROs and whatnot, like is there opportunities for them at the state level past that initial kind of entry job that you mentioned, or is it just like a functional area that's almost more of an assignment where then they move on?
So it kind of really depends on each state.
Okay.
And on each, honestly, on each individual's kind of, career desires. For the most part, I would say most of our force managers at the state level do that assignment at the state headquarters. They work in the force management world for that assignment and maybe a follow-on assignment as a mobilization readiness officer, which is another position within the state that generally oversees the force management function within the state. But then by and large, they'll then return, to their basic branch. Like for me, after I was the FIRO in Pennsylvania, I then went on to AGR assignments within the 5/6 Striker Brigade. So I was back to doing, basic branch kind of work within the full-time force. Now, for the state FIROs, though, we also do have opportunities up here at the national level. There's a number of states that will have their FIRO come up here for an AGR opportunity here within Army National Guard Force Management to kind of broaden themselves and kind of to see that next level of force management before coming back to the state to continue their career either at the state headquarters or again back into the basic branch kind of service.
I guess what if you were to sell us on force management and becoming an FA50, like what are the biggest pros?
Right. So one, I think it's a great opportunity to be part of Army transformation, looking out towards the future.
Okay.
So as I mentioned, the Army's in the middle of this kind of transformation from being a BCT-centric force to being a division-centric force, going from counterinsurgency, global war on terror to prepare for a large-scale combat threat against a peer, near-peer enemy. So being part of that, ground floor level discussion where we're shaping and designing the Army for 10 and 20 years from now, I would say it's very fascinating work. You kind of have to be a little bit intellectually curious as to how those process work, and then to wanting to be kind of part of that professional staff officer planning process. In addition to that, I think it's it takes an interesting or maybe a slightly different perspective on feedback. If as a company commander out, executing a live fire range, or if you're a soldier doing IWQ, when you send a round down range, you either, you hit the target or you don't. You get immediate feedback. For a force manager, when we do our jobs well, we may be doing a organizational design for something that's going to take effect 5 or 10 years from now. So the feedback loop, you may read about something, when you're in your next assignment, or you could be, in your civilian life as a retired officer, seeing, certain aspects of force management actually come into fruition and execution, since it is part of a longer range.
I was gonna say that's like got to be a little bit of it's like an interesting dynamic to be in. You're like, well, they can't blame me because I'll be gone by the time. But on the other hand, it's like the reward piece, it does come later, like you're saying.
Absolutely.
So what would you say then? I think I cut you off in the middle of, you were talking about your pipeline a little bit, but So you went through, you did the fire responsibilities, you went back, did stuff at the unit level in your branch.
Hmm.
Then you came up here. Now you're working in force management again. I guess having worked at both of these echelons, what are the big key like takeaways or lessons learned that you would apply if you did have to go back to the operational force again?
Oh, sure. So I think one of the biggest benefits I would say is from being a force manager at both the state and the national level is being able to see and understand resourcing and decision-making processes at the national level and how they trickle down to state and unit level. So understanding the resource management and the processes for determining unit requirements, organizational design, and resourcing.
And how does so like I've only seen it from the soldier perspective, right? So we see like, oh, unit gets moved and so a bunch of soldiers switch MOSs, people don't want to move, or we hear
Mm.
that like eventually we're going to get light tanks in the IBCTs. I don't know, I've been hearing that for years and years. You know at your echelon, kind of getting to deal with some of these things, like what are those, what are the what can you tell soldiers at the unit level um, about like how these changes are part of a broader strategy
Sure.
that is evolving the Guard into being the next generation of whatever nest within the president's designs and whatnot.
Right, right. So, what I would say is, if I were back, working in a BCT or in a division, I would be excited about the future and about where the Army is transforming to. And what I mean by that is, as I kind of previously mentioned here in the podcast, as during the global war on terror and the coin-based BCT-centric force design era, the brigade combat team was kind of the focal point for the Army, and it will always remain as a foundational organization for tactical employment. But under COIN, each BCT had kind of a modularity-based design where they had the ability to generate effects independently within the BCT. So they had their own artillery, their own engineers, own signal, own MI. As the Army is transforming to being division-centric, divisions will now be the primary unit of action and the preferred formation for tactical employment. So what that means for BCTs and for the battalions and the companies within them, they really get to focus on the core mission of the brigade, which is to close with, destroy the enemy, and prevail in close combat, and to be the close combat force for the Army.
Yeah.
So to me, that would be very exciting, as if I were a company commander again, to be able to truly be focused on the close combat fight and to be part of really the fighting part of the Army and drive all things from a priority perspective from training management to achieve that objective.
It's really interesting. Like, so, we've talked, you're mentioning the BCTs being that unit of action. We have all these BCT focused training events, right? JRTC and DC. Do you think that with the changes to divisions being the unit of action, we'll ever go to like a division level exercises as far as a, training center?
So, I mean, that's certainly an interesting question. And of course, the divisions already do have, capstone training events where they execute warfighter exercises and our brigades with their CTC rotations, both at JRTC and at the NTC. So I am sure that as the Army does transform over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, that the design of those capstone training events will be adjusted to ensure that our divisions are put in the best position possible to be the unit of action for tactical employment.
So a couple more questions. One, if I'm interested in becoming a force manager, where do I start?
Sure.
And then two, just if you had to do it over again, what would you have done differently? And what's your advice to those people, that are 10 or 15 years behind you?
Yeah. So as far as entering into the FA-50 functional area, I think it kind of depends where you're at. So if you're at the state level and you're listening or viewing this podcast, I would reach out to your state headquarters or somebody that you may know that has served at the state headquarters and inquire about potential assignment within the state G3 or J3 office or wherever the force management function goes on. So perhaps to seek that assignment as the force integration readiness officer within the state. For the officers and soldiers here in the Title 10 AGR program or here working at the national level, if they're interested, again, those post company command senior captains and junior majors that would be interested in force management work, they can reach out to myself or Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Croft, who was here earlier. We'd be happy to discuss in great detail, the work of force managers here at the national level, beyond what we discussed here today. What was your second question?
Yeah, well, I have another question actually before we
Okay.
get to that. So you just mentioned, seek out some of those assignments. Is there anything, so like you mentioned how the Army runs course, like is that something that soldiers can look to attend before they go into those force management roles to try to set them up for success if they're applying for jobs and stuff? Or, what's your recommendations on training that soldiers can do ahead of time?
So I think probably at the state level, how the Army runs course just based on throughput is generally limited to those assigned or already determined to be going into to a force management type assignment. And likewise here at the national level, we do have there is some capacity for soldiers to attend the Army, how the Army runs. But if soldiers are generally interested in coming to the force management course, we can discuss that and see what positions and slots are available.
Nice. And then I guess the last question is advice really to your younger
sure.
self, like 15 years ago, what advice would you give yourself from the lessons you've learned, both as a force manager and just as an officer in general?
Right. So one of the things that force management, I think, really teaches you or almost forces you to do is learn about a lot of the organizations outside those that you're assigned to. So when I was, a younger captain, spent, time in, infantry battalion and, units within, the 5/6 Stryker Brigade in Pennsylvania, I knew kind of the organizations that were part of my battalion or part of the brigade. So if I had to give advice to myself, it would be earlier in my career, paying attention to all the other unit types, both that were within my state, but then also that are, kind of exist, throughout the Army. Because that's what force management really does, is we examine and, the organizational design of the total force. So that would be the piece of advice that I would give to myself, is to pay attention more so to the total force, or at least having some situational awareness of the other types of units across the Army, because it really is. There's, a tremendous amount of great work being done across all the warfighting functions and kind of functional domains across the Army.
Wow. Well, thank you, sir.
Absolutely.
I guess if the audience wants to learn more, they've always got How the Army Runs.
That's right. If they want to have any light reading, or if they have trouble sleeping at night, once they pick it up, they'll be more than ready to put it down based on its both size and maybe perhaps some of the content. But it is, in all seriousness, no, it is very interesting to read, learn, and understand the processes for force development at the national level.
Well, thank you, sir, for coming and sharing some of your experiences, and look forward to seeing you again. So.
Awesome. Appreciate it.
If you would like more information on any of the topics discussed today, please visit our social media pages in the links below. Tune in to Leaders Recon over the next few weeks as we bring in today's leaders and pioneers to discuss their experiences, share their wisdom, and help you grow as a leader. If you like this episode of Leaders Recon, please don't forget to subscribe below and leave us a 5-star review. You can find us wherever you listen to your favorite podcast.